Okay, everybody. So this lecture here is on the nervous system. And so when we think of the nervous system, what do we think of? What's the whole purpose of the nervous system when we're looking at it? Like, what makes up our nervous system when we think about it? Like, what are the organs of it? Or it's the brain and the nerves and all the sensory receptors that we have. What is the whole purpose of the nervous system? The nervous system is about control of the body. All of our organs in our body act as kind of instruments, like you can think of a symphony. And you have all these instruments that can play individually, but if you want it to sound good, everybody has to kind of play in time and in tone to make sure that those sounds are good. And so if you go to any orchestra, you're going to see somebody up front that's got the little stick and they're doing the thing. That's the conductor. And they basically keep everybody playing together. And that's how your nervous system works. Your nervous system essentially controls all the organs in the body, and nothing happens without the regulation of the nervous system. Now, the brain and the nervous system are probably one of the most complicated systems that we have in the human body. The good news is that we can kind of simplify it. So if you simplify the way that the nervous system works, it can kind of only do really like three things. And so the first thing that it's going to do is your nervous system has to know what's happening outside and inside the body. So you're going to have receptors or sensory organs that are going to tell your brain about what is happening in the world around it and also in the inside. So for example, we can take light and we can convert that into electrical energy in our eyes, and then we can process that energy inside of our occipital lobe, and that creates vision. We have an eardrum that can respond to mechanical vibration, and then that gets turned into an electrical signal inside of our ear, and that's going to go to our. And that, am I bothering you? He just came out and gave me this look. I'm bothering my wife for you guys. Um, so anyway, that's like an auditory input, and that's how we hear things. So we can also have like touch, tickle, itch, and then we can have stuff inside of us. Like you can, maybe you feel some pain in your side, or you can feel that your bladder is swollen because you have to go to the bathroom. That's all information. And then you have things that you might not be conscious of, like your control of your blood pressure or osmolarity of your blood or your blood sugar. Your body is always sampling the environment around it, and it's sampling the environment inside of it. So that takes what that's called sensory information. So it's stuff that's going to stimulate your senses, and your brain is going to take in information. Now, that information has to be processed. So that information is generally going to be processed in the central nervous system. So inside the brain of the spinal cord. It's going to take that information. It's going to say, so for example, let's say I have a bug that's crawling on my arm. It crawls on my arm, and those sensory receptors are now sending signals up my nerves to my neck, to my spinal cord, up through my medulla, up through the thalamus, to my somatosensory cortex, where that information gets processed. And it says, hey, bug's crawling on you. Then it's going to communicate with all the different other areas of the brain, like your memory area, your fear center, your frontal lobe, which is going to be like, hey, what's the most logical way to get out of this situation? And then it's going to come together and it's going to make a decision. And it's going to say, hey, we should probably knock this bug off of our arm. So now you have to have an effect that's going to happen. So now you had sensory information that came in, it got integrated in the brain and the spinal cord. Then we have to send efferent or motor information out. So what's going to happen? Well, I can contract my biceps and my triceps, and I can flip the wrist, and I can flick that bug off of me. And that's basically how your system works, is that you take in information from a sensory system, you process it in the central nervous system, and then you have some output. Now that output, um, in this case was to my muscles. That's going to be a somatic motor system. You can also have a visceral response to things. So it doesn't just need to be motor. Like you see this bug and all of a sudden you start getting scared. And so what happens is your brain is going to send a signal to your heart to tell your heart rate to speed up so that you can pump blood around because now you're in this fight or fight response. So basically the nervous system is all about communication and it's all about control. How does it do that? There's a three-step process. You have sensory information that's going to come in, it gets integrated, and then there is an output that is going to carry out some response. Now, what makes up the nervous system? Well, there's a couple of things that make up the nervous system. So, as you remember in chapter 5, there are 4 types of tissues. There's epithelial, connective, nervous, and muscular. And remember that nervous and muscular are the only 2 electrically excitable tissues in the human body. And we know that tissues are made up of cells. So nervous tissue is only made up of 2 types of cells. And what were they? They were neurons, and then they were the glial cells. So as far as the neurons go, these are the main people in the show. These are the people that do everything. The glial cells are kind of all the helpers. The neurons are the actors. These are the electrically excitable tissues. They can conduct electricity. They're going to secrete things. So with neurons, if we look at the structure of a neuron, let me find one here, we can see that you should know these neurons. So I would be able to draw a stupid picture like this and then be able to label it. So what do we have here? We have a neuron. What is the purpose of the nervous system? To send and receive and process signals. So if we are going to receive signals from places, we're going to have little antennae. Those antennae here, these are called dendrites. Those are the dendrites. They're going to receive information. Either they're going to be sensory receptors out in the periphery, or they're going to receive information from other neurons. This part is called the nucleus or the soma. And in this area, this is where all the cellular processes are going to happen. Then we've got to send information down. So that is going to go down an axon. And at the end of the axon, you've got what's called an axon terminal, and that's where a synapse will get made. So in our muscle chapter, we had a motor neuron that was going to send a signal to tell our biceps to contract. That electrical signal traveled down through the axon terminal. And then what it did was eventually calcium gets released here, and then that causes the release of neurotransmitter acetylcholine, and then acetylcholine bound to the receptor on the outside caused depolarization of the cell, which caused a release of calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which then bound to troponin and tropomyosin, which then causes it to change shape, which exposes the active site, which allows actin and myosin to form cross bridges. You get the power stroke, then you get the sliding of actin over the myosin, and that gets a shortening of the muscle. The last parts of our neuron are going to be this area right here, known as the axon hillock. And this is a special place where all the magic happens of a neuron. It's also known as the trigger zone. And then here you've got your phone charger, has insulation over it, so do your neurons. And so this is called myelin. It's a myelin sheath, and it insulates your neurons. Okay, so that is a neuron. Now, what is the other? And this, remember, this is what sends and receives signals. This is the main actor. This is the show. But there are going to be glial cells. So let's look at our glial cells. We have 6 types of glial cells. There are 4 in the central nervous system. There are going to be 2 in the peripheral nervous system. Now let's go back and say, what do you mean when you say central versus peripheral? Well, hold on. Central nervous system is going to be the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is everything else. It's all the nerves, ganglion, it's all the stuff in your GI tract. That's the difference. So when we come down here and we say that the glial cells, we've got 4 in the central nervous system that are live in this brain and spinal cord, and we have 2 in the peripheral nervous system. So what are those? Let's go down. Where are we? So the first one that we're going to look at is called an ependymal cell. Now, this is a word that is weird to pronounce. And I'm sorry, not an ependymal cell. An oligodendron. I'm very tired. This is an oligodendrocyte. And so oligodendrocyte is a very weird word. And as far as new words come, if you can't pronounce a word, then you do not understand it. So make sure that you can sit and practice saying oligodendrocyte. So oligodendrocyte here, what does it look like it's doing in this picture? This oligodendrocyte is what makes myelin. It myelinates your neurons. Now, the next one that we're going to look at is called the astrocyte. And the astrocyte here, you can see it's between your neuron and the blood. So this is what is going to create the blood-brain barrier. And it also regulates the environment inside the fluid. So blood-brain barrier, structural support. Oligodendrocyte makes myelin in the CNS. Then, if we have this blood-brain barrier, what it does is it essentially cuts off the brain from all the rest of the systems, because the brain is super sensitive to infection, it's super sensitive to dehydration, super sensitive to electrolyte change. So it's cut off. It is basically in a penthouse. You got to get a little key card to be able to get in there. There's a whole wall blocking everything off. Then, since it's blocked off kind of from the immune system, it has its own immune system. And that immune system those are called microglial cells. These are these guys right here. These are little macrophages that live inside the brain, and they work to be able to clear the brain of pathogens. They regulate inflammation. It is 2024, so they don't have just one job. They also work as nighttime cleanup crew. So when you go to sleep at night, these glial cells get to action and they clean up all the dirt and the debris and the dust and all the stuff that you've made in your brain. That's why one of the many reasons why sleep is really important. It cleans out all the bad gunk in your brain. Okay. The last thing is that the brain does not just sit inside your skull. It's kind of floating there. And what does it float in? It floats in this stuff called cerebrospinal fluid. One of the reasons for that, it provides a layer of protection so your head's not always bumping up against your skull or your brain. It's also because the extracellular environment has to be a little bit different from neurons. We'll see that a little bit later in this chapter. And it also provides kind of support so that the brain doesn't collapse underneath its own weight. You think about a whale in water, it's going to float. But you think about a whale on land, it's going to collapse under its own weight, and that's kind of what happens to the brain. I don't know if you've ever like rested your arm on your elbow and all of a sudden the whole thing's gone numb. Nervous tissue does not like pressure on it one bit. So those are the ependymal cells. They produce cerebrospinal. The last two are going to be Schwann cells. Schwann cells do exactly the same thing as the oligodendrocytes. What do oligodendrocytes do? They make myelin in the central nervous system. What do the Schwann cells do? They make myelin in the peripheral nervous system. And then what are satellite cells? They're supportive cells inside the PNS. So make sure you know that. There's a bunch of questions on one of your tests on these 6 glial cells. I think there's like 3 or 4 questions. I'm not sure on this test, but maybe on a future test. On test 3, I think, or test 2 or test 3. All right. So far, we know the functions of the nervous system. We know the 2 main parts, the CNS and the PNS. We know that the brain and the nervous system works by sensory information coming in. We have a thing that's going to process it, and then we have an output. We know the neurons and the glial cells make up the nervous tissue. We know what the 6 glial cells do. We know where we find them. We know the anatomy of a neuron. You can draw it. Okay, now lastly, what we need to do is talk about further divisions of the nervous system. So let's look. We've got brain and spinal cord, everything else, peripheral nervous system. But here we can look at this chart. So the central nervous system is brain and the spinal cord. And what's going to happen here? Remember, there's 3 parts. There's sensory information comes in, it gets processed, motor information goes out. Some sort of decision. So this is where all the processing is going to happen, is inside the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system, on the other hand, it's going to handle the sensory information in and the motor information out. So you got two divisions here. You've got sensory and motor of the peripheral nervous system. Sensory information comes in from the peripheral nervous system. Motor information goes out the peripheral motor system. Tell some sort of or organ or something to do something. That's what motor means. Sensory means it's getting some sort of information to your brain. Now, that information can come from one or two areas. It can either be a somatic sensation, which is essentially tickle, itch, joint movement, muscle stretching. Like that's all pain, temperature. That's all like outside somatic stuff. Anytime you think of somatic, that's what you think of. Visceral, on the other hand, visceral means organs. So if you have a see something that's visceral, or you have a visceral reaction, like if you see somebody barfing, that's gonna generally make me want to barf. I don't know if you guys are like that. Hopefully not as nurses, because you're probably gonna see a lot of barf in your life. But viscera means your organs. So this is sensory information from your organs. This is sensory information from your muscles, joints, skin. And those are the two divisions of your sensory system. So for example, imagine that somebody is, they've eaten a lot of food and their intestines and their digestive, they're stretched out. That would be some sort of visceral sensation that you'd be having. Or if you could feel heart palpitations, that would be visceral. Somatic would be like somebody coming in and just like pinching you. That would be somatic sensory. And then sensory information is all information that's going to come in: sight, sound, tickle, touch, itch, pain, temperature, any senses that you can think of. Proprioception, mechanoreception. Motor is going to be the decision that your brain has made. And it's either going to tell a muscle to do something, or it's going to tell an organ or a gland to do something. If it tells a muscle to do something, that is a somatic motor. That's all somatic means. Just think of muscles and joints. Visceral means organs. Just want to make sure I was recording. Visceral means organs, the control of your organs, because your brain is in control of all your organs. Nothing happens in your body without knowing. So there's two divisions of this visceral motor system. So for the motor division, we can tell our muscles to do something. So we did that in the last chapter. Yeah, just like we did just 2 seconds ago. You have a signal that comes down from your brain, it travels down the spinal cord, it goes down a nerve, goes to a muscle, it meets the neuromuscular junction where acetylcholine gets released, which binds to a receptor, which leads to a sodium influx down the T-tubules, which then stimulates the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release calcium, et cetera, et cetera. Make sure that you can go through that process. But the visceral motor division has two parts to it. There's a sympathetic and a parasympathetic. So there's two states that we can be in. We can be in our fight or flight anxiety brain, or we can be in our parasympathetic rest and digest and chill out and heal and recover. The reason we do this is because we only have, or I suspect that the reason human beings do this is because there's only so many resources to go around in the body. So you've only got so much blood to give to either your muscles or your digestive system, but you don't want to have to supply both at the same time. So, for example, it's a bit like turning the lights off when you leave a room, or when you leave the house, you want to turn the AC up because there's going to be nobody here, so you don't need to use that room. So that's the way it is with our body, is that we don't need to use every system in our body at all times. So for example, if you're going to run from a lion that's trying to eat you, do you really need to worry about digesting food at that point in time? Like, I don't think you do. You don't need to worry about concentrating your urine. You're not worried about, you're not worried about eating at that point. Same thing goes if you're resting and digesting. You just had Thanksgiving, had a couple glasses of wine, maybe a pumpkin pie. Your digestive system kicks on. It's like, hey, we need to get some blood over here to help digest all this stuff. So what happens is your blood gets shunted to your digestive system. The blood go to your big muscles. Do you need to like be breathing heavy? Do you need a high heart rate to do that? No. That's the parasympathetic is going to tell all those organs. So for the best example that I can give of sympathetic versus parasympathetic is your heart. What's going to happen to your heart rate when you get parasympathetically fight or flight when you get into that situation. Something's chasing you, your heart rate needs to go up to pump blood around your body to be able to get it to your arms and legs so that you can run or fight this thing. The parasympathetic division is the relaxation and the rest and digest. So for this, you don't need to pump blood around your body too much, right? You're not running from anything. You don't need to get oxygen and glucose to stuff. So that parasympathetic is going to slow your heart down. Now it's motor because it's telling somebody to do something, like a somatic motor tells your biceps to contract. The visceral motor is going to tell an organ to do something. Okay, so make sure that you can tell me the divisions of the nervous system. You can tell me the sensory versus motor, visceral versus somatic, and then the two divisions of the visceral motor system and the difference between the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions.